Between 1346 and 1353, humanity in Europe came halfway to extinction. This was the Black Death. Chroniclers across Europe recorded testimony of the horrors that they witnessed. Estimates are that within 30 to 60% of Europeans died from a combination of pneumonic and bubonic plague. In total, including Asia and Africa, somewhere between 75 to 200 million people died. To put these numbers into perspective, at the time of making this video, 6.6 million people have died of COVID-19. Estimates from the Spanish flu of 1918 range between 17 to 50 million people. More people died from this plague than COVID and the Spanish flu combined, at a time where the Earth's population was only 1/16 of what it is today. After the devastation wrought by the plague, Europe took 2 centuries to repopulate itself back up to pre-plague numbers. In most cities throughout Europe, about every other person died. Some places were hit even harder, with more than half the population succumbing to illness. Tax documents in Florence, Italy, suggest that during only a 4-month period in 1348, more than 80% of the population may have died. Giovanni Boccaccio, who may have been an eyewitness in Florence at this time, describes the symptoms. Quote, "Here it began with young children, male and female, either under the armpits or in the groin by certain swellings, in some the size of an apple, in others like an egg, and so in variation, greater or lesser, which, in their vulgar language, they termed to be a botch, or a boil. In a very short time after, those 2 infected parts were grown mortiferous, and would disperse abroad indifferently to all parts of the body, whereupon such was the quality of the disease to show itself by black or blue spots, which would appear on the arms of many, others on their thighs, and every other part of the body, in some great and few, and others small and thick. Now as the boil, at the beginning, was an assured sign of near approaching death, so proved the spots likewise to such as had them. For the curing of which sickness it seemed that the physician's counsel, the virtue of medicines, or any other application, could not yield any remedy, but rather it plainly appeared that either the nature of the disease would not endure it, or ignorance in the physicians could not comprehend from whence the cause proceeded, and so by consequence no result was to be determined. Moreover, beside the number of such as were skillful in art, many more, both women and men, without ever having any knowledge in medicine, became physicians, so that not only few were healed, but almost all died within 3 days after the said signs were seen, some sooner and others later, commonly without either fever or any other accident." Unquote. The contagion infected animals in addition to humans. One of the best theories to explain the spread of bubonic plague is that the disease was spread by rats. Fleas would transmit the contagion from these rats to humans. Boccaccio illustrates a scene in which 2 pigs play with discarded blankets that were used by a plague victim. Quote, "One day, the rags of a pauper who had died from the disease were thrown into the street, where they attracted the attention of 2 pigs. In their wonted fashion, the pigs first of all gave the rags a thorough mauling with their snouts, after which they took them between their teeth and shook them against their cheeks, and within a short time they began to writhe, as though they had been poisoned. Then they both dropped dead to the ground, spread-eagled upon the rags that had brought about their undoing." Unquote. Nobody at the time understood the true causes of disease. The medieval medical professionals explained that the plague was being caused, perhaps, by warm, damp air. They recommended avoiding swamps, marshes, or other bodies of stagnant water. They reasoned that the plague could be prevented by closing windows, especially those facing south, because the sun tended to heat up air in that direction. Some even suggested covering their windows with wax cloth for protection. The Muslim physician Ibn Khatima emphasized the importance of location in the spread of disease. Worst of all were places with open ocean to the south, because the sun's rays reflected off the water, warming and humidifying the air. Burning dry and good-smelling wood was recommended, such as juniper, ash, vine, rosemary, oak, and pine. Disease often exists in association with bad smells, so medieval doctors guessed that perhaps these smells were themselves causing sicknesses. Fragrant-smelling plants were therefore thought, by combating the bad smells, to prevent infection. Some people who believed bad smells to be the cause of disease came to the opposite conclusion, postulating that if bad smells passed infection, then they could also serve to inoculate oneself against illness. The physician John Cole made the following observation, quote, "Attendants who take care of latrines, and those who serve in hospitals and other malodorous places, are nearly all considered to be immune," unquote. In discussion of this, John Kelly remarks, quote, "John Cole argued that the best antidote to bad air was more bad air. One of the most surreal images to emerge from the Black Death is of knots of people crouched at the edge of municipal latrines, inhaling the noxious fumes," unquote. A group of religious fanatics believed that plague was a punishment sent from God for the sins of humanity. The solution, therefore, was to find forgiveness for one's sins by engaging in self-punishment. These were the flagellants, who often stripped naked and whipped their bodies, arms and legs, so much that blood poured off of them into the streets. Groups of more than 100 individuals could be found marching across Europe, engaging in this self-mortification. They used a kind of whip called a scourge. This was a kind of stick from which 3 tails with large knots hung down. These knots contained iron spikes as sharp as needles, and each spike was about the length of a grain of wheat. A contemporary reports that occasionally one of these iron spikes would be driven so deeply into the flesh it could only be pulled out by a second wrench. John Kelly says the following about the practice, quote, "At the sight of the flagellants, shoeless, hooded, and dressed in white cloaks, with a red cross on the front and back, shouts of 'Save us!' would rise from the crowd. Some spectators wept. Swooning women clasped their hands to their breasts. A few people laid their dead in the square for a blessing," unquote. Ironically, this group of eccentrics, hell-bent on finding a cure at any cost, probably aided in spreading the plague. Many reasoned that the deaths may have been part of a great Jewish conspiracy. Rumors in the Swiss town of Chillon spoke of the evil Rabbi Jacob, who was allegedly in charge of a secret network of Jewish terrorists. These agents, so people whispered, were distributing plague poison across Europe. This was perhaps made from poisons derived from frogs, lizards, or spiders. This poison was then deposited in wells and other sources of water. Nobody seems to have considered the fact that Jews were dying at exactly the same rates as non-Jews. All over Europe, Jews were murdered in a variety of different ways. Some were bludgeoned to death, while others were burned at the stake in large public bonfires. Some were even stuffed into empty wine casks and then drowned. In Frankfurt, the local Jewish community was raided and looted by the self-professedly repentful flagellants. Jean de Fate reports, and I quote, "Already, the flagellants, under the pretense of piety, have spilled the blood of the Jews, and frequently also the blood of Christians," unquote. Many of the rich and wealthy did their best to escape crowded cities for the safety of rural areas. Unfortunately, plague touched even the remotest places and spared no one. In the remote village of Tusededal in Norway, the plague killed every single person, except one, When a rescue party arrived a few months later, they found a solitary little girl who was the only survivor of plague in that place. The rescuers called her the wild bird because she had become insane after living alone for so long. Even when the death seemed to be over in 1353, it was only the end of the beginning. The plague returned off and on for hundreds of years, but never in a way as devastating as in 1346. This dramatic first wave of plague displayed a unique set of symptoms. Part of what made the years between 1346 to 1353 so bad was pneumonic plague. This form of the disease could be spread through the air and made people cough up blood. It killed quickly and spread even faster. It's likely that the disease mutated over the course of the following years, because these symptoms are not recorded in later plagues. Death rates were never again so high across all Europe. Still, only 8 years after the end of the first wave came a second wave of plague in 1361. Those who lived through it called it les mortalités des enfants, or the children's plague. Guy de Chauliac noticed, and I quote, "A multitude of boys and few women were attacked," unquote. How could this second wave have affected children so much more than adults? The reason is that the children of 1361 were the only ones around who hadn't been alive a decade earlier to develop immunity from exposure to the primary wave of plague. For the centuries that followed, plague splashed around Europe, 1 year over here and the next over there. The plague returned again in 1368, 71, 82, 1409, 21, 39, 54, 56, 66, 81, 87, 1492, and still again after that. Upheaval often is accompanied with the names of heroic characters and their stories. However, the Black Death left us with no such personality. The tragedy of the reality that those people lived through was total and absolute. Abraham Santa Clara of the city of Vienna reports, and I quote, "There were small children who were found clinging to the breast of their dead mothers, and of one fierce little girl who, as her dead mother was placed on the cart, tried to accompany her by force, and with a lisping tongue continued to cry, 'Mommy, Mommy,' bringing water to the eyes of the rough and hardened corpse-bearers." Unquote. Thank you for watching.